She stepped off that train carrying 43 pounds of luggage and a lifetime of being told she was too much. Too heavy, too foreign, too stubborn to survive a place like this. The men on the platform stopped talking. The women stopped pretending they weren't looking. One boy laughed outright until his mother yanked his collar hard enough to snap his head back. Ingrid Falk stood there in the November wind, her canvas bag in one hand, her ticket stub still in the other, and she did not look down. Not one once. If this town wanted to judge her, it was going to have to do it while she was standing up straight. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train had been running 4 hours late out of Minneapolis, which meant Ingrid spent most of that extra time sitting in a car that smelled of coal smoke and someone else's lunch, watching the land outside the window change from something almost recognizable into something that looked like the end of everything. She had grown up in a village outside Gothenburg, where the trees grew close together, and the winters were cold but orderly. Snow that fell in measured amounts, frost that arrived on a schedule. This was different. The plains outside the window went on in a way that made her feel slightly unwell, like looking down from a height. No breaks in it. No hills to interrupt the sky. Just that flat, gray-brown stretch of ground running out to a horizon that kept retreating no matter how long she watched. She ate the last of her bread somewhere around the Kansas border, realized she had nothing left in the paper bag, folded it carefully anyway, and put it in her coat pocket. Old habit. Her mother had done the same thing. You kept the bag until you were certain you had no more use for it. The woman across the aisle had been watching her on and off for the past hour. She was somewhere in her 50s, traveling alone, with a carpet bag on the seat beside her, and the particular expression of someone who has already formed an opinion and is simply waiting for the chance to deliver it. "You heading to Blackridge?" she asked. Ingrid looked up. "Yes." "You got family there?" "No." The woman's expression shifted slightly, not quite to judgment, but moving in that direction. "Work? Housekeeping position?" The woman looked her over in that open way people sometimes did, as if Ingrid weren't sitting right there watching her do it. "Long way to come for housekeeping?" Ingrid folded her hands on the bag in her lap. "Yes," she said. She had learned over the years that agreeing with people was sometimes the fastest way to end a conversation. The woman across the aisle seemed disappointed by the lack of further detail and eventually turned back to the window. Ingrid had come a long way for housekeeping. She was aware of that. She was also aware that there hadn't been much else on offer. Not in Minneapolis, where she'd spent 8 months working in a laundry that steamed in summer and froze in winter and paid her barely enough to cover her rooming house. Not in the 3 other positions she'd applied for, where the women who answered the doors had looked at her and then looked past her in that way that meant the job was already filled, or was going to be, or would be, the moment a thinner candidate showed up. The advertisement in the Minnesota paper had been plain enough. Seeking capable woman for housekeeping duties. Blackridge, Kansas Territory. Room and wages provided. Reply to G. Halverson, Blacksmith. No description of the house, no mention of the work beyond the single word housekeeping. But it had been answered by a letter. An actual letter. 3 short paragraphs in careful, slightly stiff English that told her the hours would be long, and the house had been unmanaged for 2 years, and she would need to be someone who could figure things out without being told twice. She had written back the same day. The reply came in under a week. Position is yours if you can be here by the 15th of November. G. Halverson. That was it. No questions about her size, which she had braced herself for. No request for a description. She was either the only person who had answered, or the man had decided that anyone willing to travel to a place called Blackridge in the middle of November was probably serious enough to hire. She arrived on the 17th. The train had been late. The station at Blackridge was a single-room building with a wooden platform and a sign that looked like it had been painted and repainted so many times the letters had begun to blur at the edges. 3 men stood on the platform when the train pulled in. 2 of them together, the third slightly apart, leaning against one of the posts with his hands in his coat pockets. Ingrid stepped down with her bag and stood for a moment while the wind came at her from the west, cold and direct, with nothing to slow it down. She had not fully understood until that moment what flat land meant for wind. Back home there had always been something in the way, a ridge, a line of trees, a neighbor's barn. Here, there was nothing, and the wind behaved accordingly. The two men together were talking and barely looked at her. The third man pushed himself upright from the post and walked over. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Not handsome exactly, but built in a way that suggested he had been working with his hands for a long time, broad through the shoulders and thick in the arms, with a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors. He had a short beard going slightly gray at the jaw, and eyes the color of the sky outside, that flat northern gray. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment, not the way the woman on the train had looked, not assessing, not forming an opinion, just confirming. "You made it," he said. 2 words. That was the entire greeting. She had expected more, or less, but not exactly those 2 words in that tone, which was somewhere between matter of fact and something she couldn't quite name. "The train was late," she said. "I apologize." "I know. I checked." He reached for her bag. She let him take it because arguing seemed like the wrong way to start. "Gunnar Halverson," he said. "Ingrid Falk." He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he'd already worked out, and turned toward the single dirt street that ran away from the station. She followed him. The 2 men on the platform watched her go. She heard one of them say something, low enough that she couldn't make out the words, and then the other one laughed. A short, private sound that she had learned over the years to recognize. It was not a friendly laugh, but she kept walking, and they fell behind her, and after a moment they were gone. Oh, Blackridge was, as far as Ingrid could tell, about 4 blocks long and 2 blocks wide, with a main street that had a general store, a livery stable, a small hotel with a sagging porch, a saloon, and several other buildings in various states of maintenance. There were houses behind the main street, most of them modest, some of them barely that. The whole thing sat in the middle of that enormous flat landscape like something dropped from a height and not yet moved. Gunnar's house was on the far edge of town, separated from the nearest neighbor by a stretch of open ground that the wind had turned into a kind of no-man's land of dried grass and scattered fence posts. The smithy was next to the house, a large, low building with double doors that were currently shut, with a faint smell of iron and coal coming from somewhere around it, even in the cold. The house itself was wooden, 2 stories, with a covered porch that had a broken board near the steps. Ingrid noted that without saying anything. Inside it was warmer than the street, but not by a great deal. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace that was working but low, and a general atmosphere of a space that had been lived in by a person who was not particularly interested in living spaces. There was nothing dirty about it. She had been prepared for worse, but there was nothing comfortable about it either. The curtains were functional rather than anything else. The table had a single lamp. The shelves on the wall held things that were there because they needed to be somewhere, not because anyone had arranged them. "There's a room at the top of the stairs," Gunnar said. He set her bag on the table. "Bed, chest, fireplace needs a flue check. I'll do it tomorrow." "I can check it." He looked at her briefly. "You know flues?" "I know enough to know if something's wrong with one." He seemed to accept that. "Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward a door. "I eat early, usually, before the forge, and again at midday if there's work to stop for. I don't have particular requirements about food. Anything hot is enough." "All right. The water comes from a pump out back. It freezes before sunrise some mornings, so it's worth getting your water the night before when the weather's cold." "I understand." He was looking at her again, Dutch, not rudely but steadily, as if recalibrating something. She had the impression he had made some plan in his head before she arrived, and was now quietly revising it, not because she had disappointed him, but because she wasn't quite what the plan had assumed. "You've done this work before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, different houses, different arrangements, but the work itself is the work. "The last woman left in March," he said. "Before that it was my wife." He said that last part in a different tone, not softer, not harder, just slightly separate from the rest of the sentence. "The house has been managed badly since then." Ingrid looked around the room. "I can see it needs attention," she said, which was accurate without being unkind. Something that might have been a brief, almost smile crossed his face and then was gone. "I'll leave you to get settled." He moved toward the door. "There's bread in the kitchen and coffee on the stove. It's been there a while." "I'll make fresh." He paused at the door. You don't have to tonight. I know I don't have to, she said. He left. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, listening to his boots cross the porch and then crunch away through the dirt toward the smithy. Then she picked up her bag, went to the kitchen, found the coffee. He was right. It had been there a while. Emptied it, started over, and began looking through the shelves to see what she actually had to work with. The kitchen was in better shape than the rest of the house, which suggested that Gunnar at least cared enough about eating to maintain the one room where food happened. The stove was a good one, solid, with no cracks in the firebox. The pots were mismatched but serviceable. There was flour, salt, dried beans, 2 tins of things she couldn't immediately identify, a smoked ham hanging from a hook near the back wall, and a modest collection of root vegetables in a bin near the door that were getting to the point where they either needed to be used or composted. She rolled her sleeves up, found an apron on a hook by the stove, put it on, and set about making something from the vegetables and the ham before they went entirely to waste. She wasn't hungry. She'd been too tense on the train to eat much, and now the tension had shifted into a kind of focused energy that she recognized and knew how to use. The town outside was going quiet as the evening came on. Through the kitchen window, she could see the smithy, its doors still closed, and a faint orange glow under one of them that told her Gunnar was still working. She had met men who worked late as a way of avoiding the rest of their lives, and she had met men who worked late because they were behind and needed to catch up. She couldn't tell yet which kind he was. When she had the soup going and the bread warming on the back of the stove, she took her coffee and sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself, for the first time since Minneapolis, to stop moving. She was 32 years old. She had been in America for 6 years. She had worked in a laundry, in a boarding house kitchen, in a wealthy family's house in St. Paul, where the mistress had been kind but the other staff had not, and then the laundry again when that position ended. She had sent money home to her mother until her mother died 2 winters ago, and after that she had kept working because it was the only thing she knew how to do, and because the alternative, sitting still and thinking about what her life amounted to, was not something she could afford. She was not pretty, or at least not in the way that counted in the places she had been. She was heavy-bodied, broad through the hip and shoulder, with a face that people called pleasant when they were being polite and plain when they were being honest, and hands that were roughened from years of hot water and lye soap. She had gotten used to the way people looked at her, the quick, assessing look that measured and then made a decision, and she had gotten used to the particular loneliness of being someone who worked hard and well and was valued for it, but never for anything else. What she had not gotten used to entirely was the man on the platform saying you made it in that particular way, as if he had genuinely expected her and was genuinely glad she had arrived. She heard boots on the porch and then a knock. He knocked on his own back door, which told her something about him, and she called that it was open. He came in, stopped at the smell of the soup, and stood there for a moment. I said you didn't have to tonight, he said. There were vegetables going off, she told him. It would have been wasteful. He sat down at the table across from her without being asked, which she took as a good sign. At least he was comfortable in his own kitchen. She ladled soup into 2 bowls, cut bread, put it on the table, and sat back down. They ate in near silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, exactly, but the silence of 2 people who did not yet have the common language of routine and habit. Outside, the wind had picked up. The walls of the house were solid enough, better insulated than she had expected, which meant he had taken some care with it at some point, but she could hear the weather moving against it. The curtains need replacing, she said, when they were about halfway through the meal. I know. The front porch board. I know. The storage room off the kitchen, there's a gap in the floor that should be addressed before the cold gets worse. He looked at her across the table. Not annoyed. More like he was filing things. How long were you in the house before I came back? About 40 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. You worked fast. I work methodically. There's a difference. He seemed to think about that, then nodded. I'll get to the porch board this weekend. I can manage the curtains myself if you tell me what's available at the dry goods store. And the floor gap I can probably address with rags and nails as a temporary measure. You don't need to fix everything the first night you're here. I'm not fixing anything tonight, she said. I'm making a list. He looked at her again, and this time the almost smile stayed a little longer before it went away. They finished the soup. He helped her clear the bowls, just stacked them by the basin without her asking, which she also noted. And then they stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular awkward beat that comes at the end of a first shared meal when no one quite knows who should move first. "I start at the forge at 6, he said. "Earlier if there's a delivery. I'll have coffee ready before 6. You don't need to—" "I'm up before 6 regardless," she said. "It's not special effort." He held her gaze for a moment. She had the sense he was deciding whether to argue further and concluding it wasn't worth it, and then he nodded. "Good night, then," he said. "Good night." He took the lamp from the hook near the door, and she heard him cross through the main room and go up the stairs. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment with the dying light from the stove, listening to the wind work against the house, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness. Not yet. That was too large a word for a night like this, in a strange house, in a strange town, with the wind trying to find the gaps in the walls. But something adjacent to it, something quieter. The specific feeling of being somewhere she was actually meant to be. The first few days were a form of reconnaissance. She was up before 5 each morning, had coffee on before the dark lifted, and spent the early hours while Gunnar was at the forge moving through the house systematically. She worked from the top down, started with the upstairs rooms, which had been mostly closed off and smelled of disuse, aired them out, assessed what needed to be done, and moved to the floor below. The house had good bones. She kept returning to that thought, which was perhaps a strange thing to notice about a house. But it mattered. The walls were straight, the floors, where they weren't gapped or warped, were solid, and whoever had built the place had understood that the weather here was not something to negotiate with. The problems were the problems of neglect, not of decay, which meant most of them were fixable if you were patient and thorough. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on the second day, which turned out to be lighter than she'd expected under 2 years of grime. She repaired the gap in the storage room with strips of cloth and cut nails and the handle of a broken broom, a solution that was neither elegant nor permanent, but would serve through the winter. She got the main room's fireplace drawing properly by cleaning out a partial blockage in the flue. The problem had been a bird's nest that had come apart and settled in the damper, which was a straightforward fix once she knew what she was looking for. She heard, on the third day, 2 women talking outside the dry goods store as she came around the corner with Gunnar's list. She was not part of their conversation, and they did not see her until she was already close enough to make avoidance awkward. One of them was somewhere in her 40s, with a sharp face and good clothes, not wealthy exactly, but the kind of woman who knew exactly where her place was in a town like this, and guarded it. The other was younger, vaguely sympathetic looking, the sort of person who says unkind things in a kind tone and seems surprised when they land. The older woman recovered first. "You must be the new woman," she said. "Halverson's housekeeper, Ingrid Falk." She didn't offer a hand. They didn't offer one either. "I'm Marta Severns. My husband runs the hotel." A pause during which she looked at Ingrid in that way. "Long trip from wherever you came from." "Minnesota," Ingrid said. "Before that, Sweden." Another pause. "Have you done frontier work before? It's not like the East. The winters here are—" She tilted her head slightly. "Particular." "I imagine they are. Not everyone manages." The younger woman said this in the sympathetic tone, which made it worse than if she'd just said it plainly. "It takes a certain kind of person." Ingrid looked at her. "I suppose it does," she said, and went into the store. Inside, the storekeeper, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Aldous, who turned out to have a dry sense of humor and no apparent interest in her appearance beyond the fact that she was a new customer, helped her find what was on the list and added some unsolicited opinions about the quality of his competitors' goods that she found useful. "You're working for Halverson," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He bagged her flour without further comment, then seemed to decide something. "He's a fair man," he said. Quiet, but fair. "I found that to be true," she said. Aldous nodded slowly, as if she had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Outside, Marta Severns and the younger woman were gone. Ingrid walked back through the wind with her parcels and thought about what it meant to be looked at like that. The specific calculus of it, the way people looked at a body and decided from it what a person could and couldn't do. She was used to it. She had been used to it since she was a girl, when she had started growing in the ways that made her visible in the wrong ways. And she had learned over the years to keep her face neutral and her pace steady and not let the looking reach the part of her that it most wanted to reach. What she had not quite figured out how to stop, even now, was the small, persistent hope that the next place might be different, that the next person would look at her and see what she could actually do, rather than what she looked like doing it. By the end of the first week, Gunnar had begun leaving small things. Not gifts, exactly. More like practical adjustments. She came downstairs one morning to find a new oil lamp on the kitchen table. The old one had a cracked chimney she'd been working around. The following day, a stack of fresh firewood inside the back door, dry and split, in a town where dry firewood was not nothing. The third time, it was a jar of pickles on the kitchen shelf, in the spot where she had been keeping the empty jar she'd washed out and hadn't yet replaced. She mentioned none of these things directly. Neither did he. But on the sixth morning, when she came down to find that the broken porch board had been replaced overnight, he must have done it by lantern light because she'd heard no hammering during the day. She came into the forge before breakfast for the first time and stood in the doorway until he looked up from the anvil. "The porch," she said. He set down his hammer. It was a hazard. "I know, I noticed." He looked at her across the forge, the heat from the coals coming off in waves between them. His face was unreadable, but not in an unfriendly way. "I work better," she said carefully, "when the house is right. It's not a complaint. I want you to know that I notice." He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the forge made its low, steady sound. "You're doing good work," he said finally. "The house is already different." Coming from him, she was beginning to understand that was the equivalent of a fairly extended speech. "Thank you," she said. "Coffee's ready when you want it." She went back to the house. She stood in the kitchen and put her hands flat on the table and took one breath slowly. It was not a large thing. He had fixed a board. He had bought a lamp. These were small, practical gestures from a man who expressed himself in small, practical gestures, and she was not going to make something larger of them than they were. But she allowed herself, in the privacy of the kitchen with the coffee going and the early light coming through the window she had cleaned 3 days ago, to feel that small, persistent hope again. She did not crush it this time. She let it sit there, cautious and careful as a bird on a new branch. And then she turned back to the stove and began making breakfast for a blacksmith and a housekeeper in a frontier town that didn't yet know what to make of either of them. On the 10th day, she went to the water pump before dawn and found it frozen solid. She had known it was coming. The temperature had been dropping steadily since she arrived, and she had been filling a large basin each evening to get ahead of exactly this. But the pump itself being frozen was a different problem. She knelt down in the dark with her lamp and looked at the problem the way she looked at most problems, which was calmly and without rushing, and eventually determined that the issue was the pipe joint about 6 inches below ground level. She went to the smithy, knocked, and told Gunnar what she found. He pulled on his coat without comment and came out with her into the dark. He looked at the pump, looked at where she was pointing, went back to the smithy, and came out with a specific tool she didn't know the name of, and spent 20 minutes lying on the frozen ground working on a pipe joint while she held the lamp. At one point, she looked down at him, this large man lying flat in the dirt in the pre-dawn dark, hands deep in a frozen pipe joint, working without complaint, and thought that whatever this place was, whatever this arrangement was, it was already more honest than most of the arrangements she had lived in before. The pump came loose with a sound like a shot. "There," he said. "Thank you." He stood up, brushing dirt off his coat. He was looking at her in that steady way again. "You had water in the basin," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes. But you came to get this fixed anyway." "The basin is a temporary measure," she said. "A working pump is better." He looked at her for another moment, then nodded slowly. Something had shifted, she thought. Not dramatically. Nothing about this man did anything dramatically, but shifted nonetheless, the way a very large, heavy thing shifts when you finally find the right point of leverage. "Go get warm," he said. "I'll make sure the joint holds before I go in." She went inside. She filled the kettle and put it on and stood at the kitchen window watching the small yellow glow of his lamp out there in the dark. A single point of light against all that enormous Kansas nothing, and felt, for the second time in 10 days, something that might one day grow into something larger. She put the cups out on the table. She waited. The joint held. She knew because she checked it herself the following morning, before Gunnar was up, crouching in the cold with her lamp the same way he had the night before. The pipe was solid. The pump drew water on the third pull, slow and grudging but working, and she stood up and pumped it twice more just to be sure. She had not asked him to fix it. She had simply told him what the problem was, and he had fixed it without being asked twice, and now she was checking his work. Not because she doubted him, but because that was how she operated. You checked. You confirmed. You didn't assume that someone else's effort would hold indefinitely without you paying attention to it. She was beginning to think Gunnar Halvorsen understood that about her. He hadn't said so, but she was beginning to think it. The town had its own opinion about her, and it made itself known in small, persistent ways. She heard it at the dry goods store when two ranchers' wives stopped talking a beat too long when she came in. She heard it at the well behind the church, where a group of women gathered some mornings, and where she was included in the general exchange of information, but not in the warmer, lower-toned conversations that happened at the edges of it. She was not shut out. She was simply placed at a specific distance and kept there, politely, by people who had already decided what she was and what she was likely to amount to. Marta Severns was the most direct about it, which Ingrid almost preferred. At least with Marta you knew where you stood. It was the second week when Marta came into the dry goods store while Ingrid was there, and the exchange was short and sharp and over in less than 3 minutes. "Still here, then," Marta said. Not unkindly, exactly. More like someone noting a fact they found mildly surprising. "I am," Ingrid said. The Nielsen woman lasted 6 days. Marta was looking at the bolts of fabric along the wall. Halvorsen's previous housekeeper, I mean. Before her there were 2 others who didn't even make it a full week. The house is in a particular state, I understand. "The house is in better shape than it was," Ingrid said, without heat. Marta glanced at her. "I don't doubt you're doing your best." It was the your best that had the edge to it. The implication that her best was a different measure than someone else's best, a lower bar that she was working hard to clear. Ingrid looked at her directly. "The kitchen floor is clean enough to eat from. The fireplace draws properly for the first time in at least a year, from the look of the flue. The storage room is sealed against the cold, and I expect the rest of the house will follow before the snow comes in serious." Marta held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was not quite respect, but was in that neighborhood. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll see." Ingrid paid for her flour and her thread and walked out into the wind. She was not hurt, or she was, but only in the way that anything repeated often enough still manages to land slightly differently each time, even when you think you've built enough wall against it. She was tired of people deciding what she was capable of from the outside of her, from the architecture of her, as if her body were a blueprint that told a complete story, as if there were nothing inside it worth looking at. She walked back to the house. She put on her apron. She kneaded the bread dough she'd been letting rise since morning, pushing her full weight into it, and the work felt, as it always did, like the clearest possible answer to everything that had been said and not said. Gunnar came in at midday and found her trimming the fat from a shoulder of pork with more force than strictly necessary. He looked at the pork. He looked at her. He got his coffee and sat down without comment, which she appreciated. "The Severns woman," she said after a moment. Not a question. "What about her?" "She seems to have opinions about whether I'll last." Gunnar was quiet, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "Marta Severns has opinions about most things," he said finally. "She had opinions about my wife's curtains. She had opinions about my forge hours. She had opinions about the color I painted the front door." "What color did you paint it?" "Brown?" Ingrid looked at him. "That seems like a reasonable color for a door." "I thought so too." He drank his coffee. "She'll come around when the work speaks for itself. Or she won't. Either way, it's not her house." It was, Ingrid thought, one of the most useful things anyone had said to her in a long time. She went back to the pork. She didn't say anything else about it, and neither did he. That was the thing about living alongside a person who didn't talk much. You started to hear the weight of what they did say. The work continued, and she let it speak. The main room curtains came first. She had found a bolt of sturdy cream-colored fabric in the dry goods store at a price that was fair, and she cut and hemmed them at the kitchen table over 2 evenings. They weren't elaborate. She had no interest in elaborate. But they hung straight, they kept the draft out, and they made the room feel like it belonged to people rather than to the cold outside. She patched two of Gunner's work shirts, which had been fraying at the seams and the cuffs in ways that suggested he had been ignoring the problem for some time. She found them in a basket near the kitchen, mended them without asking, and left them folded on the table. He came in that evening, looked at them, and said nothing. But the following morning they were gone from the table, and she found him wearing one of them at the forge when she brought out his mid-morning coffee. She reorganized the pantry, which had been stocked in the manner of a man who bought things when he was running out of them rather than before, which meant there were 3 cans of the same preserved tomatoes and no salt pork at all. She made a running list and began buying in rotation, keeping track of what was used and what needed to be replaced, the way her mother had taught her. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet mathematics of running a house that didn't run short. The neighbors started noticing before she did. It was Aldous at the store who told her, in his dry way, that there was talk. Good talk, he added, quickly, when he saw her expression. Or what passes for it in this town? People saying the Halverson place is looking different. Looking how? Like someone's living in it. He folded the top of her flour sack. Mrs. Peterson mentioned the curtains. She can see the front window from her porch. Ingrid did not know what to do with that exactly, so she thanked him and paid and went home. She mentioned it to Gunnar that evening over supper. They had been eating together most evenings by now, neither of them having made a decision about it. It had simply become what they did. And he listened to the thing about the curtains with the expression of a man who had long since stopped trying to understand what his neighbors found worth discussing. Mrs. Peterson watches most things from that porch, he said. Does she? She watched me re-nail the fence boards for 3 hours last spring, mentioned it at the general store the next day. Apparently I nail from the right side first. Ingrid considered this. Is that wrong? According to Mrs. Peterson. What does she nail from? She doesn't say. Ingrid almost smiled. She caught it before it fully arrived, but she felt him notice the almost. He looked down at his plate. The house smells like food again, he said, in a slightly different tone. Lower, less directed at anyone in particular. It's been a while. She looked at him across the table. He was not looking at her. He was pushing a piece of carrot to the edge of his plate with the focus of a man who was not particularly interested in the carrot. Good, she said simply. He nodded once and went back to eating. She stored that too. Filed it in the same place she was filing the lamp, the firewood, the porch board, the pumped water in the dark. These were not large things. She was careful not to make them large. But they added up, the way small true things do, into something she was not yet ready to name. Hooked. 3 weeks after her arrival, the first real cold came down. Not the steady chill she'd been managing, the frost in the mornings and the wind through the afternoon, that she had adjusted to, had learned the rhythms of, had built small systems around. This was different. This was a drop of 20 degrees overnight, a sky the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon, and a wind that had lost any pretense of being reasonable. She was up before 5 that morning, and the house was cold in a way it hadn't been yet, the kind of cold that tells you winter has stopped being polite. She built the fires up in both the kitchen stove and the main room fireplace, and then stood in the kitchen drinking her coffee and thinking about the root cellar. The root cellar was underneath the house, accessible through a hatch in the storage room floor that she had been keeping on her mental list of things to address. She had opened it twice since arriving, confirmed that there were potatoes and squash and turnips down there that were mostly still good, and then gotten distracted by more immediate problems. Now, with the temperature dropping hard and fast, she needed to know what state those stores were in and whether the cellar was insulated well enough to keep them through a real freeze. Gunnar found her in the storage room, halfway down the hatch ladder, with a lamp, when he came through to get to the forge. "What are you doing?" he said. "Root cellar inspection." Her voice echoed slightly from below. "There are about 30 pounds of potatoes down here, and the turnips are going soft. I need to know what's worth keeping." He was quiet for a moment. "I can do that. I've already started." She descended the last 2 rungs. The cellar was low-ceilinged and earthen-floored and smelled of cold dirt and old vegetables, which was more or less what she'd expected. She moved the lamp across the shelves. Most of the potatoes are good. Some of the squash has soft spots, but can be used if we do it this week. The turnips, she picked one up and pressed it. About half are past saving. His boots appeared at the top of the hatch. I'll come down. You'll hit your head. A pause. The ceiling's low? Unless you've grown shorter since you built this house. He didn't come down. She sorted through the vegetables methodically, calling up what she was finding and what she thought they should do about it, and he stood at the hatch and listened and occasionally offered a logistical detail she didn't have, where the spare sacking was, whether the neighbor Erickson was likely to take the surplus turnips. When she came back up, her hands were cold, and there was a smear of cellar dirt on her sleeve, and Gunnar was still standing there with the expression of a man who had been prepared to help and was mildly put out that he hadn't been needed. The cellar will hold through the winter, she said, but the door on the hatch needs new weather stripping. The cold is getting in at the edges. I can do that today. I know you can. She brushed the dirt off her sleeve. I also found 2 jars of apple preserves behind the potato bin that I think have been there for some time. Something shifted on his face. Those are... He stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the jars in her hands, and his expression had that separate quality again, the same tone she'd heard when he mentioned his wife. Not grief exactly, at least not fresh grief, but the presence of something that had been put away and was now unexpectedly present. I can put them back, she said carefully. No. He cleared his throat. No, use them. It's a waste to leave them. She set the jars on the kitchen shelf without further comment. He went out to the forge. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter, thinking about the apple preserves and the woman who had made them, and feeling quietly and carefully the particular weight of moving into a space that had belonged to someone else. She had done it before. Every house she'd ever worked in had been someone else's first, but this was different in a way she hadn't quite calculated. She was not sure yet how it was different. She was not sure she should be thinking about it at all. She put on her apron and started on the turnips that needed using before they were lost entirely. By midday, the wind was something serious. It came down the main street hard enough to knock Aldous' delivery sign off its hook, and Ingrid, coming back from returning a borrowed pot to a neighbor 2 houses over, had to walk with her head down and her coat pulled close, and still felt the cold get in at every edge. She made it back to the house and pushed the door shut against the wind's resistance and stood in the main room for a moment, breathing. The house was warm. Both fires were going well. The curtains she'd hung were keeping the draft from the windows, and the smell of the turnip soup she'd left simmering was filling every room. It was warm, and it smelled of food, and it looked now like a house that was being paid attention to. She had done that. She had done that in 3 weeks with her hands and her time and the specific knowledge that comes from years of understanding what a neglected house needs and giving it those things without being asked. She was not going to let Marta Severns or the women at the well or anyone else take that from her with a look. She went to the stove and checked the soup and told herself that firmly. Gunnar came in from the forge at midday and immediately looked at her, which was unusual. He typically came in and went to wash his hands before he looked at anything else. You're cold, he said. I went out earlier. I'm fine now. He looked at her hands. She had not entirely warmed them yet, and they were slightly red against the mug she was holding. He went to the main room without saying anything, came back with a folded blanket she hadn't seen before, and put it on the chair nearest the stove. For when you come in from the cold, he said. She looked at the blanket. She looked at him. He had already turned to wash his hands at the basin, his back to her, as if he hadn't done anything worth noting. Thank you, she said. He dried his hands. The soup smells good, he said, which was as close as he ever got to a compliment, and they sat down together and ate while the wind did its worst outside, and the house, which she had helped make warm and sound, held against it easily. The blanket stayed on the chair by the stove. She used it every morning after that, when she came in from checking the pump or bringing wood from the stack outside, and she never mentioned it again, and neither did he. It became simply part of the house's small architecture, the way everything that stayed long enough eventually did. The coffee cups on their particular hooks, the bread knife on the left side of the cutting board, the way she left the kitchen lamp turned low rather than extinguished when she went to bed in case he came in late from a delivery. Neither of them said anything about these arrangements. They just held. The trip to the dry goods store happened on a Tuesday, the 4th week of November, on a day when the sky was the flat white of coming snow, but the snow itself hadn't arrived yet. Gunnar had mentioned at breakfast that he needed to go to Aldous' for hardware, some specific grade of iron rod she didn't fully understand the use of, and that she should come along if she needed anything for the house. She had needed curtain fabric for the upstairs rooms, which were still bare at the windows, and letting cold in at the edges in a way she found irritating. She said so, and he said fine, and they walked the 4 blocks to the store together in the kind of easy silence that was, by now, their usual mode of being in the same space. The store was warm and smelled of tobacco and sawdust and the particular sweetness of the penny candy jars behind the counter. Aldous was with another customer when they came in and gave Ingrid a nod and Gunnar a nod that seemed to contain slightly different information for each of them, and went back to his business. Ingrid went to the fabric bolts at the back of the store. The selection wasn't large. This was Blackridge, not Minneapolis, but there was enough to work with. She ran her hand along the options, feeling the weight of each one, thinking about the upstairs windows and what they needed. Something with enough body to block the draft. Something that wouldn't look like she'd grabbed the cheapest option, because that was all the budget allowed, even if the cheapest option was largely what the budget allowed. She found a pale green wool blend that was exactly right in weight and texture and cost 4 cents more per yard than she could reasonably justify. She looked at it for a moment, pulled it out far enough to check the weave, then put it back and reached for the sensible cream muslin 2 bolts down. Gunnar was at the hardware end of the store talking to Aldous about the iron rod, and she paid no attention to him while she made her calculations about the muslin. She bought what she needed, had it measured and cut, paid for it, and was waiting near the door with her parcel when Gunnar came to pay for his hardware. They walked back in the same easy silence. He carried her parcel along with his own, without asking, which had stopped bothering her sometime in the second week. She hung the muslin curtains the following morning, and they were perfectly adequate. They blocked the draft. They looked clean. They did the job. She was satisfied. 2 days later, she came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and found a small brown paper parcel on the kitchen table next to the coffee cups. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked to the table and opened the parcel. The green wool was folded inside. Not a bolt, just enough yardage for 1 window's worth of curtains. Along with it, coiled neatly on top of the fabric, was a spool of green thread in a shade close enough to match that it would disappear into the seam. She stood there looking at it for a long moment. She heard Gunnar's boots on the porch. He'd been at the forge since before she woke and was coming in for coffee, and the door opened behind her. She did not turn around. "The thread," she said. He stopped just inside the door. "In the stores." She picked up the green spool carefully. "I looked at it for about 30 seconds before I put it back. I didn't say anything about it." He was quiet. She heard him hang his coat on the hook by the door. "I wasn't sure of the exact shade," he said finally. "I described it to Aldous, and he said this was the closest." She turned around then. He was standing by the door with the expression of a man who had done something perfectly ordinary and was slightly puzzled that it was being treated as anything else, except that the expression was just slightly too composed to be entirely convincing. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze and held it without looking away. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." He moved to the stove and poured his coffee. "The upstairs room on the right gets more light in the morning. The color will be better there." She looked back down at the fabric in her hands. The green was not a practical color. It was the color of something growing, of something chosen, because it was wanted, not because it was sufficient. She couldn't remember the last time someone had bought her something because she had wanted it and then put it back. She thought about what to say and decided there was nothing she could say that would be more accurate than what she was already feeling, and that what she was already feeling was not something she was ready to put into words in a cold kitchen at 6 in the morning. "I'll make it for that room," she said. "Good," he said. They drank their coffee. The silence between them was the same as it always was, and completely different. She was not naive about what was happening. She had lived long enough and watched enough people closely enough to understand that what was growing in this house was not simply the dynamic of a good working arrangement. She knew that. She had known it since the blanket on the chair, if she was honest, or possibly since he said you made it on the station platform with that tone that was not particularly warm and yet somehow was. What she didn't know was what to do with it. She was his housekeeper. She had come here for wages and a room, and she was good at this work. And the work was honest, and she wasn't going to compromise it by letting herself believe something was true when it might simply be the behavior of a decent man who treated everyone in his life with the same practical consideration. except she watched the way he talked to other people, and it wasn't the same. He was fair with everyone. She had come to understand that about him. Aldous had been right. But he was not with other people the way he was with her. There was no patience of this particular quality, no attention of this particular quality. She thought about his wife's apple preserves still on the kitchen shelf, which she had not opened yet and was not sure she should. She thought about the fact that she had been here almost a month and had not asked him a single direct question about his marriage, and he had not offered anything beyond those 2 sentences on the first night. She was not sure whether that restraint was respectful or cowardly or simply appropriate. The green curtain went up in the upstairs room on the right, the one with the morning light. She had been careful with the seams and the hem, more careful than the muslin ones downstairs, and when she hung them and stepped back to look, they were the best curtains she had ever made. Not because of her skill, which was the same skill as always, but because she had made them out of something that had been given to her for no reason beyond the fact that she had wanted it. That distinction mattered to her in a way she didn't entirely know how to explain. She was up there checking the hang of the fabric when she heard horses in the yard below, and 2 of them, moving fast, which was unusual at this hour. She went to the window and looked down. 2 men on horseback, neither of them familiar. They rode into the yard with the particular urgency of people who have ridden hard to get somewhere and are not entirely certain of their welcome. One of them called toward the forge. Gunnar came out of the smithy. He listened to what the men said. Ingrid watched his posture change, not dramatically, but she had been watching him closely enough for a month that she read the shift. Something was wrong. She came downstairs and outside, pulling her coat on as she went. The men were ranchers. She could tell that much from the gear and the look of them, both in their 30s, both worn in the way of men who spent more time outside than in. The one talking to Gunnar had his hat in his hand and was speaking quickly, something about a horse and a brake, and the Erickson ranch, which she knew was 6 miles east. Gunnar looked at her when she came around the corner of the house. Erickson's mare broke her foreleg on the fence, he said. Lars is in town for supplies and they can't reach him. They need someone who can, he paused, manage things at the house until he's back. His wife has the 2 youngest sick with fever. Ingrid looked at the 2 men. One of them glanced at her with that familiar flicker of assessment and then away again. How long has the fever been running? She asked. The man with the hat looked back at her, slightly surprised that she'd asked rather than waiting for a male voice to handle it. 2 days, he said, not breaking. What have they been giving them? Mrs. Erickson's been doing willow bark tea, but she's near exhausted. There's no one else out that way. Ingrid looked at Gunnar. He was watching her. I can go, she said. It's 6 miles. I can ride. He looked at her steadily. She had never mentioned riding before. There had been no occasion to, and she could see him recalibrating again, that quiet internal revision. The gray in my stable is steady, he said. All right. She turned to go back in for her kit. She kept a small case of basic things, not medical exactly, but close enough. Clean cloth, the herbs she'd learned to keep on hand, a small bottle of the compound that worked for fever in children when the bark tea wasn't enough. Ingrid, she stopped and looked back. Gunnar was still watching her. Be back before dark, he said. Not a command. Something closer to a request. I'll do my best, she said. She went inside, got her kit, and was on the gray horse and out of the yard inside of 12 minutes. The Erickson place was exactly what she had expected from the description, a good farm run by people who worked hard and had no margin for catastrophe. Britta Erickson met her at the door with the specific look of a woman who is managing everything and has nothing left over, thin and dark-haired and entirely unsentimental. You're Halverson's woman, Britta said. It was not an unkind characterization, and Ingrid let it pass. I'm his housekeeper, Ingrid Falk. Let me see the children. The 2 youngest were 5 and 3, a girl and a boy, both febrile and miserable in the way of small, sick children, restless and hot, and intermittently crying in that thin, exhausted way that means they've been at it too long. The older one, the girl, was worse. Her fever had been high enough long enough that Ingrid changed what she was going to use, switched to the compound in her kit rather than the bark tea, and sat with the child for the better part of an hour, making sure it was going to hold. Britta sat in the doorway of the room and watched her work. The Peterson girls said you were large, Britta said at one point. Ingrid was focused on the child's breathing. The Peterson girl is accurate. She said you'd be useless out here. She said that directly? Britta paused. She implied it. Ingrid adjusted the damp cloth on the girl's forehead. Mrs. Erickson, right now the only thing I care about is your daughter's temperature. We can discuss the Peterson girl's opinions later if you like. Britta was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Fair enough, she said. By mid-afternoon, the girl's fever had come down to something manageable, and the boy, whose case had been milder, was asleep. Ingrid had also, in the intervals, gotten soup on the stove from what was in the kitchen, brought in wood from the porch pile, and found a crack in the bedroom window that was letting cold air directly onto the sick children, which she sealed temporarily with a strip of cloth from her kit. Lars Eriksson arrived back in late afternoon, came through the door in a rush, and stopped short when he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a woman he didn't know standing at his stove. The children? He said. Sleeping, Britta said. Both of them. Temperature is down. He looked at Ingrid. You're Halverson's housekeeper, Ingrid said. Ingrid Falk. Your soup is on the back of the stove. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He was a big man, a farmer's build, and the specific deflation of a person who has ridden fast for 6 miles expecting the worst and found something manageable was visible all through him. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You don't need to. She was already pulling on her coat. Keep the girl's temperature monitored through the night. If it goes back above where it was, send for the doctor from Millhaven, not just the bark tea. I will. And fix the window. He looked confused. The bedroom window has a gap. I've sealed it for tonight, but it needs proper repair. They'll be sick again inside a week. Lars looked at his wife. Britta was watching Ingrid with an expression that was, for the first time since she had arrived, openly warm. I'll send Lars to Halverson's, Britta said, properly, to say thank you. That's not necessary. Maybe not. Britta held her gaze, but I'll do it anyway. Ingrid rode back toward Black Ridge in the late afternoon light, the gray horse steady under her on the frozen road, the plains going dark at the edges where the sun was dropping. She was tired. Not badly, just the good, specific tiredness of work that had mattered. And the cold was real but manageable, and she found herself thinking not about the Erickson children, or the ride, or even Britta's expression. She was thinking about Gunnar saying be back before dark in that tone. Not a command, closer to a request. The difference between those two things was something she had spent her whole working life navigating, and she knew the difference absolutely. He had asked. She pushed the gray into a slightly faster pace and came into Black Ridge with the last of the light still in the western sky, the forge already lit and glowing orange against the dark as she rode into the yard. Gunnar was at the forge door when she came around the corner of the smithy. He looked at her, all of her, quickly, the way you look at someone when you've been thinking about their safe return. And then his expression settled back into its usual composure. You made it before dark, he said. I said I'd do my best. She swung down from the horse. Her legs were stiffer than she'd expected. It had been 2 years since she'd ridden any significant distance, and she absorbed that gracefully enough, she thought. The children are stable. Fever's down. He nodded. He was standing close enough that she could see the forge light on the planes of his face, and he was looking at her with an expression she didn't quite have a word for yet. Not relief, exactly. Something steadier than relief. He reached out and took the gray's reins from her hand, and his fingers brushed hers as he did. Just the back of her knuckles, briefly, without intention, and neither of them acknowledged it. I kept supper warm, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The forge behind him sent heat out into the dark night air, and the whole town was quiet around them. And she stood in the yard of this house she had been rebuilding piece by piece for a month. In front of this man she was learning in the same careful way. Thank you, she said. He turned to lead the horse to the stable. She went inside, hung her coat on the hook by the door, and found supper on the back of the stove the way he'd said, kept warm and waiting, as certain as anything she had known in a long time. Lars Eriksson came to the house 3 days later, as Britta had said he would. Ingrid was in the yard splitting kindling when he rode up. Not a task she was supposed to be doing, strictly speaking, But the supply near the back door had gotten low, and Gunnar was running a full day at the forge with 2 ranch orders due, and she saw no reason to wait. She had done it before, in other houses, other winters. She was not fast at it, and her arms would remind her tomorrow, but she was methodical, and she didn't leave splinters. Lars dismounted and stood for a moment, taking in the sight of her with the hatchet, which he was polite enough not to comment on. "Mrs. Falk," he said. "Mr. Eriksson." She set the hatchet down. "How are the children?" "Better, both of them. Sigrid was up asking for breakfast this morning, which—" He stopped, and something moved across his face that was not entirely composed, "which is more than I expected 2 days ago." "Good. You fixed the window?" "First thing yesterday." He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture as the rider who had come for Gunnar, and she was beginning to think it was a local habit when men were working up to something. "I brought you something, from Britta." He reached into his coat and produced a small jar. "Jam, strawberry, from this summer. She wanted you to have it." Ingrid took the jar. It was a good jar, well sealed, the wax neat around the lid. She could tell from the color that Britta had put care into it. "Tell her thank you," Ingrid said. "That was kind. She also—" He hesitated. "She wanted me to say that she spoke out of turn when you first arrived in town. She didn't say exactly what she'd said, but she wanted it acknowledged." Ingrid looked at him. She knew exactly what Britta had said, or the category of it anyway, and she also knew that an acknowledgement delivered secondhand by a husband was Britta Eriksson's version of a significant gesture. "Tell her it's forgotten," Ingrid said. Lars nodded. He looked briefly toward the forge, where the sound of hammer on iron was going in its steady rhythm. "He's lucky to have found someone capable," he said. "This is a hard place to manage alone." She didn't correct the implication in found, which would have required more explanation than either of them needed in a yard in December. "He manages fine," she said instead. "He just needed the house to catch up to him." Lars considered that, nodded again, and went to say his piece to Gunnar through the forge door. Ingrid picked up the hatchet and went back to the kindling. She put the strawberry jam on the shelf next to the apple preserves she still hadn't opened. 2 jars now, side by side. She looked at them for a moment before she started supper and thought about the different kinds of things that accumulate in a house when people start paying attention to it. The real winter arrived the second week of December, and it was not gentle about it. The snow came in overnight, the kind that means business, not the light early season snow she'd been watching blow across the yard for weeks, but genuine accumulation, 1.5 feet by morning, with more coming and no indication from the sky that it planned to stop. The wind drove it sideways, and the temperature dropped to the kind of number that made you stop thinking about it as a temperature and start thinking about it as a condition, something to be managed the way you manage any threat. She was awake before the snow had fully arrived, at that particular hour when the wind changes sound and tells you something is coming. She dressed, built up both fires, moved the remaining firewood from the yard stack onto the porch before the drifting could make it difficult, filled every large container in the house with water from the pump while it was still running, and had coffee and porridge on the stove by the time Gunnar came down at 5:30. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the water containers, the firewood she had stacked inside the back door, the state of the stove, and then at her. "You've been up since 3, he said. It wasn't a question. 2:30, she said. The wind shifted. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man recalibrating something. Then he sat down and poured his coffee. "I need to get to the Halverson Ranch today," he said. "Not mine. A family east of town, same name, different spelling. They've got a wagon axle I promised before the snow. If I don't get it done in the next few days, I won't be able to reach them until the thaw." "How far?" 8 miles in good weather, more today with the drifts. She put the porridge in front of him. "What time do you need to leave?" "First decent light. I'll have something ready you can take with you. It'll be a long day." He looked at her across the table. "You'll be all right here?" "I've managed worse than a snowstorm." She sat down with her own bowl. "The question is whether you'll be all right out there." He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to people asking that question, specifically the expression of someone who couldn't quite decide whether it was presumptuous or not, and had landed on not. "I've done this road in worse," he said. "I don't doubt it." She ate. "I'll have a kit ready for you to take. Dry cloth, the fever compound, in case you have to stop somewhere. I'm not going to need... Probably not. She looked at him steadily. But take it anyway. He held her gaze. Then he went back to his porridge. She packed the kit. She also packed 2 thick slices of bread with the smoked ham, wrapped in cloth, and a flask of the strong tea that held its heat longer than coffee in the cold. She handed it to him at the door while he was pulling on his second coat. He took the bundle and looked at it and then looked at her. "You're fussing," he said. "I'm being practical." There's a version of practical that looks a lot like fussing, and there's a version of stubborn that looks a lot like unnecessary suffering, she said. "Take the food." Something happened in his expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. He tucked the bundle under his arm. "I'll be back before dark." He said it deliberately, using her words from the Erickson day, and she felt the deliberateness of it land somewhere in her chest in a way she didn't examine too closely while he was still standing in front of her. "See that you are," she said. He went out into the snow. She watched him go from the kitchen window, the broad shape of him moving through the white, the horse steady beside him, both of them diminishing into the gray of the storm. And then she turned back to the house and the long work of keeping it sound against the weather. It was a bad day, not catastrophically bad. The fires held, the walls held, the water stayed unfrozen, but the kind of bad that required constant small attention. The wind found the gap under the front door she had been meaning to address and got into the main room in a way that cost her half an hour of her firewood reserve. She fixed it with a rolled length of cloth and some careful nailing and felt the satisfaction of solving a problem that had been waiting to be solved, undercut slightly by the awareness that she'd let it wait too long. Around midday, when the snow was still coming and the light was that flat white that makes time difficult to judge, there was a knock at the front door. It was Marta Severns. Ingrid stood in the doorway and looked at her, genuinely surprised. Marta was dressed for the weather, practical rather than fashionable, and her expression was not the calculating one she usually wore. She looked tired. "My husband fell," Marta said without preamble, coming in from the stable. "His wrist, I think it may be broken. The doctor is in Millhaven and the roads." "Come inside," Ingrid said. She brought Marta in and heard the whole story in the kitchen over tea. Jakob Severns, 61 years old, had gone down on the ice between the hotel's back door and the stable, trying to check on the horses in the storm. He was inside now, in pain, the wrist swollen and wrong. "I don't know who else to ask," Marta said. She said it in a specific tone, the tone of a woman who does not ask easily and finds it difficult. "I know you're not a doctor, but you helped the Erickson children," and Britta said, "I'll come," Ingrid said. She was already moving. She took her kit and her coat and went to the hotel with Marta through the storm, head down against the wind, and found Jacob Severns sitting in the hotel kitchen with his wrist on the table and the look of a man doing his determined best not to make a sound. She examined the wrist carefully. It was broken. She could tell that much. A clean break rather than a complex fracture, which was the better of the bad options. She had set a broken bone once before, years ago, a child on the farm where she'd worked her first year in America, and she had hated it and done it because there was no one else. "This is going to hurt," she told Jakob. He looked at her with the measured respect of a man in significant pain. "I guessed that. I want to be clear before I start that I'm not a doctor and you should see one as soon as the roads are passable." "Understood. Do you want something to hold on to?" "I'm fine." He was not fine, but he held. She set the wrist as cleanly as she could manage, splinted it with the material she had, wrapped it firmly, and gave him the last of her compound for the pain with instructions about how often and how much. By the time she finished, she was sweating despite the cold and her hands were not entirely steady. Marta walked her back to the door. "He'll need to see the doctor in Millhaven," Ingrid said. "Inside 2 days if the road's clear, which they should." "I know." Marta looked at her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not just for today." Ingrid looked at her. "I said things, or implied things, that were unkind." Marta said it flatly, the way she said everything, but her eyes were direct and honest. "About your ability to manage here, I was wrong." Ingrid was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was doing its relentless work. "You weren't alone in thinking it," she said finally. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Ingrid agreed. "It doesn't." They stood there for a moment in the kind of silence that comes after honesty that costs something. "Can I ask you something?" Ingrid said. "Yes." "Was any of it actually about my ability? Or was it about something else?" Marta's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. "Halverson's been alone for 2 years," she said carefully. "This town worries about him. When someone new comes in," she paused, "people want to be sure." "Sure of what?" "That it's the right situation. For him." Ingrid absorbed that. "And now?" Marta looked at her for a long moment. "Now I think he's in very capable hands," she said, and the words covered more ground than a wrist splint. Ingrid walked back through the storm. The snow was deeper than when she'd come out, and the wind was direct and cold, and she was tired from the work on the wrist and the long day and the fires and the sealed door and all of it, and she walked steadily back to the house because it was hers to get back to. She came in through the back door and stood in the kitchen warming up, and it was past dark already, which meant Gunnar was late, and she put more wood on the stove and more coffee on and sat down to wait, because sitting down was the appropriate response, and not because she was worried. She was worried. She heard the horse at 40 minutes past dark, coming in from the east at a walk, and she was at the back door before she had consciously decided to go there. He came around the corner of the house leading the horse, snow-covered and slow in the way of someone who has been cold for a long time and is managing it deliberately. He looked up and saw her in the doorway and stopped. "I said before dark," he said. His voice was slightly rough from the cold. "You're not that far past it." She stepped back to let him in. "Stable the horse first. There's coffee." He took the horse to the stable. She went back inside and stood at the stove, telling herself she was managing the coffee, not managing the particular feeling of a long day alone in a storm, waiting for a man she had not expected to be waiting for. He came in 10 minutes later, cold through, and she put the coffee in front of him without ceremony and sat across from him at the table the way they always sat. "The axle's done," he said. "The road back was difficult." "I can see that." He looked at her more carefully. "You look tired." "It was a long day." She told him about Jacob's severance and the wrist, concisely. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said a broken bone," he said. "I've done it once before. I don't enjoy it." "But you went." She needed someone. He was looking at her in that way, the steady, gray way, and the kitchen was warm and the storm was still outside, and they were both tired, and she was too tired to construct the careful distance she usually maintained. "Marta Severns apologized to me," she said, "for the things she'd implied about whether I'd manage here." "Good," he said. "She also said," Ingrid paused, turning her coffee cup in her hands, "that the town worries about you, that people wanted to make sure any new situation was right. For you." Gunnar was very still. "I thought you should know that's how people see it," she said. "The arrangement, whatever it is." "And how do you see it?" he said. His voice was quiet and completely direct. She met his eyes. "I think it started as one thing," she said carefully, "and has become something I don't have a simple word for." He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked, the wind pushed at the walls, and the walls held. "I haven't wanted to say anything wrong," he said finally, "or too soon, or in a way that would make you feel—" He stopped, trying to find it, "obligated, because of the work, because of the position." She understood exactly what he meant, and she understood that it had cost him something to say it, because he was not a man to whom saying things cost nothing. "I am not easily obligated," she said. He looked at her. "I know that. And I am not easily made to feel things I don't actually feel." He was still looking at her. The storm outside was its own steady sound, and the house they were sitting in was warm and whole, and she had made it that way, and he had helped her, and whatever was at the table between them had been building since a November platform with 2 words and a pair of steady gray eyes. "All right," he said softly. "All right," she said. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to, not tonight, not in the middle of a December storm with the work of the day still on them, and the coffee going cold in their cups. But something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and they both knew it, and the knowing sat between them like the warmth from the stove, present and real, and quietly, stubbornly sufficient. She got up to put more wood on the fire. He got up to help, and their hands were on the same log for a moment, and neither of them made anything of it, and both of them did. The storm broke on the third day. Not gently. It didn't taper off the way some storms did, grumbling and fading over the course of an afternoon. This one simply stopped, the way a very loud sound stops, leaving behind a silence so complete that Ingrid stood at the kitchen window on the morning of the fourth day and felt the absence of noise as something almost physical. The sky had gone a hard, clear blue. The snow lay across everything in that particular undisturbed way that happens after a real storm, smoothed and shaped by the final hours of wind into curves and angles that made the familiar yard look like a different place entirely. She stood there with her coffee and looked at it for a long time. The last 3 days had been a specific kind of close. Not uncomfortable. She wanted to be precise about that, at least in her own thinking, but close in the way that two people in a house during a genuine storm are close, which is to say constantly aware of each other in ways that ordinary days don't require. She had learned over those 3 days that Gunnar moved quietly for a large man, that he had a habit of reading near the fire in the evenings with a particular stillness that most people couldn't sustain, that he took his coffee without anything added and drank it slower than she would have expected, and that he had a way of listening, actually listening, not waiting for his turn, that was rarer than it should have been. She had also learned that he was not good at being idle. The storm had kept him from the forge for most of the second day, and she had watched him try to read, try to work on a small piece of metalwork he'd brought inside, try to simply sit and fail at all of it. He was a man built for useful work, and the absence of it made him restless in a way he was clearly embarrassed by. On the second afternoon, she had handed him the list of repairs she'd been keeping. Not her original 10-day list, which was long since addressed, but the ongoing one. The things that came up as a house was lived in through a hard winter. And he had looked at it and then looked at her and said, "You've been keeping this." "I keep track of things," she said. "You knew that." He spent the rest of the afternoon fixing the interior shutter on the upstairs window and replacing a hinge on the cellar hatch that had been getting difficult. She heard him working above her while she cooked, the small sounds of a man doing something purposeful, and the house felt right in a way it only did when both of them were in it and occupied. That was the thing she had not anticipated when she had stepped off the train in November, that a house could feel differently depending on who was in it and what they were doing. That the same four walls could be merely adequate or something else entirely based on something as simple as whether the person you were sharing them with was present and engaged rather than absent or indifferent. She had lived in houses with indifferent people. She knew the specific quality of that, the way the space itself seemed to contract around you. This was not that. She poured her second coffee and began making a mental list of what needed doing now that the storm was over. Because the storm being over did not mean the winter was over, it meant there was a window of manageable weather to accomplish things in before the next one arrived. Gunnar came down at his usual time, and she had his coffee ready before he reached the table, which was so established by now as a habit that neither of them remarked on it. "Roads will be passable by midday," he said, looking out the window. "Ericsson's will need checking. Lars sent word before the storm that his firewood situation was marginal." Gunnar looked at her. "You've been corresponding with Lars Eriksson." "Britta," she said. "She sent a note with the Aldous delivery. I wrote back." He absorbed this. "You've been corresponding with half the county, apparently. Someone needs to know what's actually happening out there." She sat down with her own coffee. "Aldous says the Bergman family on the North Road came through the storm all right, but they're low on flour. Mrs. Peterson's roof has been problematic since October, and if the snow load doesn't come off it carefully, there's going to be a collapse." Gunnar set his cup down. "How do you know about Mrs. Peterson's roof?" "She mentioned it at the well in November. I've been watching the snow accumulate on it from the upper window." She paused. "It needs attention today." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man confronting evidence that his house had become, without his noticing, a kind of informal operations center for the surrounding community. "I'll go to Peterson's after the forge," he said. "I'll come. 2 people can move the snow safely. 1 person on that roof alone is a bad idea." "You're not going on a roof." "I didn't say I was going on the roof. I said 2 people. You on the roof, me managing the ladder and watching the load." He opened his mouth and then closed it, because the logic was sound, and he was a man who, she had learned, respected sound logic even when it inconvenienced him. "Fine," he said. The Ericksons first, though. Fine. They ate breakfast. Outside, Blackridge was beginning its post-storm emergence. She could hear it, the sound of shovels and voices and animals being seen to, the particular industry of a frontier town digging itself out. She thought about what Marta had said, about the town worrying about Gunnar, about wanting to be sure any new situation was right for him. She thought about what she and Gunnar had said to each other in this kitchen 4 nights ago, in the quiet after the long day, with the storm outside and the wood in both their hands. She thought about all the things that had been said and not said over the past 6 weeks, and how the balance between those two categories had been gradually, carefully shifting. She was 32 years old, and she had not expected this. That was the honest truth of it. She had expected the work, and she had expected to do it well, and she had expected to perhaps earn a measure of respect from a difficult town over a difficult winter. She had not expected to find herself in a house that felt like it had been waiting for her specific combination of capabilities and stubbornness, or a man who expressed himself in green thread and warm firewood and supper kept on the back of the stove. She was not going to let herself be reckless about it. That was also the honest truth. She had too much history of careful management to simply abandon it because something felt more right than anything had felt in a long time. But she was done pretending it wasn't happening. Mrs. Peterson's roof was exactly as bad as Ingrid had assessed from the upper window. They went to the Ericksons first, as planned. The firewood situation was indeed thin, and Gunnar spent 2 hours splitting and stacking while Ingrid sat with Britta and the children, who were fully recovered, the girl Sigrid now running between rooms with the specific energy of a child who has been sick long enough that not being sick feels like a personal triumph. Britta made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked in the easy way of women who have moved past the early stages of figuring each other out. Britta was direct and occasionally blunt, and had opinions about most things, qualities Ingrid found restful compared to the kind of sociability that required you to decode what people actually meant. "He looks different," Britta said at one point, nodding toward the window where Gunnar's work sounds were coming from. "Who does?" Britta gave her a look. "Halverson. He came out here in September for some metal work, and he looked," she chose her word carefully, "worn. Like a man who had been managing alone too long and knew it and wasn't going to say so. He doesn't say much." "I know. Lars is the same way." Britta poured more coffee. "But there's a difference between a man who doesn't say much because he's content and a man who doesn't say much because there's no one worth saying things to." Ingrid held the coffee cup and looked at the window. "He's not worn now," Britta said simply. Ingrid didn't answer that directly, but she didn't redirect the conversation either, which was its own kind of answer, and Britta was perceptive enough to understand it. When they left the Ericksons, Gunnar with wood-splitting sweat still on him despite the cold, they rode the north road toward Mrs. Peterson's, and the landscape around them was the hard, bright white of post-storm Kansas, beautiful in the specific, indifferent way of things that don't care whether you find them beautiful. The sky was that impossible blue. The snow surface caught the light and gave it back at an angle that made her eyes work. "Britta Erickson seems to like you," Gunnar said, after they'd ridden a mile in silence. "She's direct. I appreciate that. She was not always kind about you, before you arrived." Ingrid glanced at him. He was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a man who has decided to say something difficult, and is saying it straightforwardly rather than carefully. "I gathered that," she said. "She told me herself, more or less. I should have said something at the time, when people were talking." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't, and I should have." She looked at him. "What would you have said?" "That I had hired someone capable, and the rest was not their business." He paused. "I didn't say it because I thought it might—" Another pause, finding the word, "make your situation more complicated. More attention, rather than less. But I've thought since that I was wrong. That silence was easier for me than it was useful for you." It was, she thought, one of the more complete apologies she had received in her life, partly because it was precise about where the fault was and didn't dress it in anything softer than it deserved. "It was not a comfortable November," she said honestly. "But I managed." "You did more than manage." "I know." She said it without arrogance, a simple fact. "But I would have been glad of someone saying something." "I'll remember that," he said. She believed him. Mrs. Peterson's roof was dealt with efficiently. Gunnar on the roof with a long-handled tool carefully redistributing the snow load, while Ingrid steadied the ladder and called up when she saw the load shifting in ways he couldn't see from his angle. Mrs. Peterson herself stood on her porch in three coats, watching them with an expression that mixed gratitude with the mild affrontedness of someone who preferred to watch trouble coming rather than have it fixed. "I told my husband about that roof in October," she announced, to no one in particular. "Is your husband available to address it?" Ingrid asked. "He passed in 1887. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He was a difficult man." A pause. "He would have hated how good those curtains look in Halverson's front window, though. He always said Gunnar had no eye for a house." Gunnar, from the roof, made no comment on this. They were done by mid-afternoon and rode back through the lowering light toward Blackridge, past the frozen creek and the stand of bare cottonwoods that marked the edge of town. And Ingrid felt the particular satisfaction of a day when the work has been real and the results have been visible and the person beside you has been, throughout, exactly who you needed them to be. January settled in and it was brutal, and they moved through it together. There was no other word for how it went. Whatever conversation they had not quite finished in the kitchen during the December storm resolved itself not in another direct conversation, but in the accumulation of days, the way they worked alongside each other, the way the house held them both, the way the rhythms of the forge and the kitchen and the long evenings by the fire had become something neither of them was maintaining separately anymore. He stopped saying "I" when he talked about the house. She noticed that because she noticed everything and said nothing about it, because some things are better received as fact than as observation. There were still hard days. That was real. There was a week in mid-January when the temperature stayed at the kind of level that makes animals stupid and people short with each other, and they were not exempt from that. She was sharp with him one morning over something trivial, a comment about the bread, of all things, which she had let prove slightly too long in the cold kitchen, and he went to the forge without eating it, which was childish, and she knew it was childish and was still annoyed, and they had a stilted supper that evening where neither of them said much. He said, before he went up, the bread was fine. It was doughy in the middle. It was fine. She looked at him. "I know how to make bread." "I know you do." He was at the bottom of the stairs, coat in hand. "I didn't say it to criticize the bread. I said it because I was cold and tired and I said the wrong thing, and I should have just eaten the bread." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I know." He put his foot on the first stair. "I'm sorry." She picked up the lamp to take to the kitchen. "Apology accepted," she said. "Don't make it a habit." "No," he said, and she heard what might have been a quiet laugh as he went up the stairs, and the tightness in her chest from the day's irritation unwound enough to let her breathe properly. That was how it was. Not smooth, not easy. Two people with long habits of solitude learning, imperfectly and sometimes grudgingly, how to account for another person. She had been on her own, in the meaningful sense, for most of her adult life. She was set in her ways about certain things. The way she kept her sewing, the way she organized the pantry, the way she liked the kitchen at the end of the day, everything in its place and the lamp turned low. These were not flaws exactly, but they were edges, and edges did not accommodate other people without some degree of friction. Gunnar had edges too. He was not forthcoming about his feelings. She had known that from the start. But she was learning the difference between private and closed off. And he was private, not closed off. He would tell her things when she asked directly. He didn't volunteer. That required adjustment on her part, a willingness to ask questions she wouldn't have asked anyone else, because she was not naturally a person who asked. He had been married for 9 years, he told her one evening in January, when the subject came up in the indirect way that things came up between them. Not fronted, not delivered, but arrived at through a conversation that had started somewhere else. He had told her his wife's name was Astrid, and that she had come from Minnesota, as Ingrid had, and that she had died of something that started as a chest cold and moved too fast for anyone to manage. He said it plainly, without making himself smaller or larger in the telling. It had been 3 years. He had spent 2 of them in the manner Britta had described. Worn, managing alone, not saying so. Ingrid had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "She made apple preserves." "Every summer," he said. "She liked to have them through the winter." "I haven't opened the jars." He looked at the shelf, where the 2 jars still sat. the apple preserves, and the strawberry jam Britta had sent. You can, he said. I wasn't sure if you... She would have thought it was absurd, he said carefully, to leave preserves on a shelf until they went off. Ingrid got up, took down the apple jar, and opened it. She put it on the table between them with 2 spoons. He looked at it for a moment, then took a small spoonful and ate it. She did the same. It was good. Sweet and slightly tart, well made. She was a good cook, he said. I know. The kitchen was organized by someone who understood it. He was quiet for a moment. It's organized differently now. I can put it back the way... No. He shook his head. I meant that both things can be true. That she organized it well and that you organize it differently, and both are right. He looked at the jar. She would have liked you, he said, which was not what she had expected him to say, and she did not know what to do with it for a long moment. How do you know? She said finally. Because she had no patience for people who couldn't do things, he said, and because she was kind to people the town was unkind to. He paused. She would have put you right at this table the first week and made you tell her everything about Sweden. Ingrid looked down at the preserve jar and felt something shift in her that she couldn't name precisely. Not grief, because Astrid was not hers to grieve, but something close to the recognition of a loss she hadn't been part of. The understanding that the space she was moving into had a shape that came from someone else's presence, and that the right response to that was not erasure, but something more like respect. I'll leave the jars on the shelf, she said, the strawberry beside them. He nodded. He understood what she meant. She was sure of it. February came, which meant the worst was past. Not over, but the back of it broken. The days beginning to lengthen in that imperceptible way that you feel before you can measure it. The forge was busy again, ranchers coming in with months of accumulated repair work, Gunner working long days and coming in tired, but the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from useful work done at full effort. Ingrid had expanded her range, without planning to, into something larger than a single house. It had happened incrementally. The Eriksson children, then Jakob Severn's wrist, then the Bergman flour shortage she had organized through Aldis's delivery network. By February, she was the person Britta Eriksson sent for when someone needed something managed, and the person Aldis consulted about what the outlying families were short of before he did his wholesale ordering, and the person Mrs. Peterson waved to from her porch every morning, as if they had always been on those terms. Even Marta Severns had thawed entirely, a process that was not warm but was genuine, and when she stopped Ingrid on the main street one morning in late February, it was not with the assessing look of the early weeks. My husband's wrist healed correctly, Marta said. The doctor confirmed it when we went to Millhaven. I'm glad. He said whoever had said it had done a clean job. I had good material to work with. Your husband sat very still. Marta almost smiled. He did. He was terrified of you. Of me? You have a way of looking at something that needs to be done, Marta said, as if you've already decided you're going to do it, and the only variable is how long it takes. It's, she paused, choosing carefully, formidable. Ingrid looked at her. I've been told it's intimidating. It is, Marta said. But intimidating and formidable are different. One makes people back away. The other makes them feel like they're in capable hands. She pulled her coat close against the February wind. Blackridge is glad you stayed, Miss Falk. Whatever else I may have implied in November. She walked on. Ingrid stood on the street for a moment in the cold wind, thinking about formidable, and whether it was different from what she had always been told, which was simply too much, too large, too stubborn, too set in her ways, too confident for the space available. She had spent years trying to make herself smaller. Not physically. She had made peace with her body in the specific way you make peace with a thing you cannot change. Not happily at first, but over time with something closer to acceptance. And then finally with the understanding that her size was simply part of the architecture of her, and the architecture was sound. But in other ways, taking up less room in conversation, making herself easier to overlook, not pushing back when she should have pushed back, because a woman who was already conspicuous by her body couldn't afford to be conspicuous in any other way. Blackridge had not made her smaller. Gunnar Halvorsson's house had not made her smaller. The work of this winter had not made her smaller. She was beginning to think that was not a coincidence. But the conversation that had been coming happened in March, On an evening when the temperature had risen above freezing for the first time since November, and the snow was beginning to concede the edges of things, the fence posts emerging, the corners of the porch steps, the yard beginning to show the dark earth beneath. Ingrid had opened the kitchen window for the first time all winter, just half an inch, just to let the smell of it in, the wet, cold earth smell of something thawing. She was standing at the counter with her hands around her coffee cup when Gunnar came in from the forge and stopped, the way he sometimes stopped when he came into the kitchen and found it different than he'd left it. "Window's open," he said. "First time the air's been worth letting in," she said. He came to stand beside her at the counter, looking out the half-inch gap at the yard. He smelled of iron and coal smoke and cold air, which had become, she realized, simply what her evening smelled like now. "Your contract was through the winter," he said. She looked at the window. "I know. Winter's ending." "It is." He was quiet. She could feel him working toward something in the way she had learned to recognize, not stalling, but approaching it carefully, the way he approached anything that mattered. "I don't want you to go," he said, plainly. No preparation, no framing, just that. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window. "I wasn't planning to," she said. He looked at her then. "That's not the same as—" He started and then stopped and started again. "I mean that I would like you to stay, not as the housekeeper." He said the last part with the particular care of someone choosing words that carry weight. "Or not only as that, or—" He made a small sound of frustration with himself that she had never heard him make before and found unexpectedly human. "I'm not doing this well." "You're doing fine," she said. "Keep going." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay because the house is better with you in it, and because I'm better when you're here, and because I have thought about what it would look like when you left, and I don't like what I see when I think about it." He paused. "That's the honest version." She held his gaze. He had gray eyes that didn't look away from things, and she had known that since November, and it still did something to her that she had given up pretending it didn't. "The honest version," she said, "is that I came here for wages and a room, and I intend to stay because I want to, not because I have to. That distinction matters to me. I know it does. And I want to be sure you know the difference between wanting someone useful in your house and wanting—" She stopped. "I know the difference," he said quietly. "I'm not a man who mistakes those things." She believed him. She had believed that about him since November, actually, since the week of small, practical gestures that were never performed for anyone but her, since the green thread, since supper on the back of the stove. A man who mistakes utility for something else does not notice a woman look at a spool of thread for 30 seconds and come back for it the next day. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They stood at the window for a moment, the cold coming in through the half-inch of open space and the smell of the thaw with it. "There are things to discuss," she said, practically. "If I'm staying in a changed arrangement." She was not embarrassed by the practical. She had been managing the practical of other people's lives for long enough to know that it mattered and that ignoring it created problems. Wages, and how things are arranged, and what the town will say, and how we choose to address that. "The town will say what it says," Gunnar said. "I stopped managing what Blackridge thinks when Marta Severns told me my door was the wrong color. Brown was a reasonable color. That's what I said." He turned to look at her fully. "I'm not a man who makes speeches. I think you know that." "I do. But I want to be clear that what I'm asking is not a small thing, for me." He said it steadily, without making it larger than it was or smaller. "I don't ask things I don't mean." "Neither do I," she said. "I know." A pause. "That's one of the things." She looked at him, this large, quiet, serious man who had fixed her pump in the dark and bought green thread and kept her supper warm and apologized for the bread comment with the specific precision of someone who understood where the fault lay. Who had not once, in 4 months, looked at her body and made it a reason for or against anything. "I'll stay," she said, "and we can discuss the practical things tomorrow, when I haven't been thinking about them all evening and you haven't just come in from a full day at the forge." He nodded. "Tomorrow. And tonight you should eat something. There's stew." He almost smiled. The full version, the one that got all the way to his eyes, which she had by now learned to look for because it didn't happen constantly and was worth paying attention to when it did. "You're already managing me," he said. "Someone has to," she said. "Eat your stew." He sat down. She brought the stew. They ate together in the kitchen with the window cracked and the smell of the thaw coming in, and outside Black Ridge was doing its first tentative reckoning with the idea of spring. Atik. The practical things were discussed as promised over the following days. Not dramatically. Nothing they did was dramatic, which she had come to think of as one of the best things about them. But carefully and directly, the way two people who respect each other's intelligence discuss matters that affect them both. She would stay. The arrangement would change in the ways appropriate to that, and they would not perform any particular secrecy about it, because secrecy in a town this size was both impossible and beneath them. If people had opinions, people had opinions. Marta Severns, when the news reached her through the particular information network of a small frontier town, came by the house herself and said she thought it was right and proper, which might have been the first time in Ingrid's experience of her that she'd deployed that particular phrase without an edge. Britta Eriksson sent another jar of jam. Aldous, when Ingrid came into the store, simply said, "Good," and moved on to discussing whether she needed the white or the cream flour, which was exactly the right response and exactly what she would have expected from him. The town adjusted, as towns do, imperfectly and at various speeds, with some people taking longer than others, and some who never quite managed it, who always looked at her with a slight residue of that early assessment. She could not make everyone see clearly. She had never been able to do that, and she had spent enough energy trying. What she could do, and did, was live her life in such a way that the quality of it was visible to anyone paying honest attention. The house went through spring and came out the other side as something it had not been since before Gunnar's solitary 2 years. Genuinely inhabited, in the complete sense. Not just occupied, not just managed, but lived in by two people who had chosen it and each other, with the full understanding of what both choices cost and what they gave. She did not stop being difficult in the ways she was difficult. She was still exacting about the kitchen and occasionally sharp when she was tired, still had the habit of making decisions without announcing them, which Gunnar found aggravating and told her so in his direct way, and she worked on with limited but genuine effort. He was still private about certain feelings to a degree that required her to ask directly rather than waiting, which she found frustrating and told him so in her direct way, and he worked on it, also with limited but genuine effort. These were not problems to be solved. They were the actual texture of two actual people building something together, which is always more difficult and more real than the version anyone imagines from the outside. One evening in April, when the yard had gone properly muddy with the thaw and the first green was showing along the fence line, Ingrid was sitting at the kitchen table with her mending when Gunnar came in from the forge, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down across from her. He put something on the table. She looked at it. It was a piece of iron, small and flat, and worked into a shape. A simple thing, a leaf. The kind of piece a blacksmith makes when he is practicing delicacy rather than strength, when he is working at the edge of what iron can do before it loses itself. "What's this?" she said. "Something I made." She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, iron being what it was, and the detail in it was fine. Each lobe of the leaf shaped carefully, the surface texture suggesting veining, the stem curled slightly at the end in a way that was not necessary and was therefore the choice of someone who was paying attention to the thing for its own sake. "When did you make this?" "This afternoon. There was a break between orders." She turned it in her hands. "It's beautiful." "It's iron," he said, but without dismissiveness. More like he was acknowledging the material honestly. "Yes," she said. "That's what makes it beautiful." She set it down on the table and looked at him. "You made something you didn't need to make. Something you made because you wanted to." He met her eyes. "Yes." She left it on the table, and later she moved it to the shelf near the kitchen window, where the morning light could reach it. It sat there between the two jam jars, the apple, the strawberry, and over time, those three things became simply part of the kitchen, as fixed and right as anything in it. There is a particular kind of courage that gets no songs written about it. It's not the courage of a dramatic moment, not the kind that announces itself with speed and noise. It's the courage of showing up to a place where you are not wanted and refusing to become small. It's the courage of working with your whole self, body and mind and stubbornness and intelligence, in full view of people who have already decided what you are worth and are waiting to be proved right. Ingrid Falk had that courage. She had been carrying it across a continent and through years of other people's houses, setting it down each night and picking it up again in the morning, wearing it so constantly that she had stopped seeing it as courage at all. She called it practicality. She called it stubbornness. She called it just getting on with things. But it was courage, the everyday kind that doesn't get a monument. What she found in Blackridge, in a house that needed her, and a man who saw her, and a town that came around eventually and imperfectly to understanding what it had been given. What she found was not a reward for that courage, exactly. She had worked too long and too honestly to believe that courage is always rewarded, or that hard work guarantees anything in particular. What she found was something more useful than a reward. She found a place where the work was worth doing, a place where being seen clearly did not require her to be smaller or larger than she was, a place where the specific, difficult, imperfect shape of her, all of her, the weight of her body and the weight of her will and the weight of her years of learning how to manage in spaces that weren't made for her, where all of that was not a problem to be solved, but a thing that was simply, plainly valued. People will tell you that you have to prove yourself. And maybe that's true. Maybe you do have to prove yourself in a town or a house or a life that starts from a position of doubt. But what those same people don't always tell you is that proving yourself is not about becoming what other people wanted you to be. It's about demonstrating through the work and the days and the small persistent choices what you actually are. Ingrid knew what she was. She had always known. It had taken Blackridge and one quiet blacksmith and a winter's worth of frozen pumps and sick children and broken wrists and green thread to create the conditions in which she was willing to stop apologizing for knowing. She had arrived carrying a canvas bag and the specific weight of a lifetime of being measured by the wrong instrument. She had set down the bag. She could not say, entirely, that she had set down the weight. Some of it goes with you, packed too carefully and too long to simply leave on a platform somewhere. But she carried it differently now. She carried it like something that had made her what she was, instead of something that kept her from being what she could be. The house stood at the edge of Blackridge through the spring and on into summer, the curtains hanging straight in the upstairs windows, cream muslin in most rooms, one room with green wool that caught the morning light, and the front porch with its solid boards and the kitchen with its ordered shelves and the shelf near the window with its iron leaf and its 2 jars of preserves. A house where 2 people had learned, slowly and imperfectly and without speeches, to account for each other. On a morning in early May, Ingrid stood at the kitchen window with her first coffee of the day and looked out at the yard, where the snow was nothing but a memory, and the fence line was showing green and the light was coming in from the east at the low angle of a morning that had decided to be generous. Gunnar came downstairs. She heard him on the stairs before he came into the kitchen, which she always did now, had mapped the specific rhythm of him in the house, the way you map someone when they have become part of the place you live. He came to stand beside her at the window, his coffee in hand, looking out at the same yard. They stood there together for a while without saying anything, because they had gotten good at that. The particular silence that is not the absence of something, but the presence of something that doesn't need words. Outside, Blackridge went about its morning. The forge would need lighting. The pantry needed flour. Mrs. Peterson would be on her porch by 8. Aldous would want to know if Britta Erickson needed anything for the week's delivery. There was mending and a loose shutter hinge Gunnar had been meaning to address, and the kitchen garden Ingrid had been planning since February that she was going to put in this week whether the ground was ready or not. There was all of that, and the whole day opening up in front of them like the yard in the new light, ordinary and real and enough. "Good morning," he said, which was how he always said it, 2 words, straightforward. "Good morning," she said, and that was enough. It had always been enough. It had just taken them a winter to find it.